Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak in English, as you hopefully already know. Yeah, it's very good to be here in Madrid after such a long time with COVID, and I must say I enjoyed the collection tremendously when I saw it again today. And the Madrid collection is, of course, not only famous for Velázquez, Rubens, Tintoretto or Goya, but also for early Netherlandish paintings, and some of the works which we can see here are really works of the first order. And it's very appropriate in a way that I can speak here on this problem of Robert Campin, or the Master of Flémalle, and Roger van der Weyden, because it was, on the one hand side, a number of works here in the Prado that were brought together and discussed for the oeuvre of this master, or rather masters, on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, some curators from Berlin museums were most important and deeply involved in the discussion of this artistic personality and even the creation of the artistic personality. So the name Robert Campin, which is the title of this lecture, is a very well-known one, but it only became well-known in the 20th century and was not well-known, never, before. And actually, what will be the issue, the topic of my talk, is that with Robert Campin, the Master of Flémalle, an artistic personality was created by modern artistry. First, it was created as a kind of artistic personality, an artificial artistic personality, and then this constructed artist was identified with a historical person, Robert Campin, and from this concept, or this union between a reconstructed oeuvre and a historical person, a whole chapter of art history was written. And it is, of course, highly problematic, as you will see. So in this lecture, I would at first give a sketch of how this artistic personality came into being and how it came to be identified with Robert Campin of Tournai. And then in the second part, I would like to look at some of the works in question and see if they are really and can really be the products of one single person. Now, before Robert Campin entered the stage of art history, there was the Master of Flémalle. And the Master of Flémalle was created in the year 1898, so approximately 120 years ago, by a Berlin scholar, Hugo von Tschudi, whom you can see here. And of course, the painting on the left-hand side of the screen is not by the Flémalle master or any early Netherlandish painter, but it's by Edouard Manet in the greenhouse or in the conservatory of 1879. And why do I show it here? I show it because this was a work that Hugo von Tschudi acquired in the year 1896, the very year he became director of the National Gallery in Berlin. And the National Gallery in Berlin is, or was at the time, the gallery of modern or of contemporary art. And of course, Manet's painting, less than 20 years old, was still contemporary. What is interesting here is that this painting by Manet was the first painting by Manet that ever entered a museum. Even in France, no museum had that far bought a painting by Manet or any other impressionist. So why do I show it here? Well, of course, I show it to make clear what the special interest and what the mind of Hugo von Tschudi was. He was very open-minded for the time, interested in a kind of art that was really not officially acclaimed. Impressionism, especially in Germany, French Expressionism, that was, of course, the art of the French enemies, so to say. And Hugo von Tschudi was very open with that, and obviously he was one of the first important museum men to find pleasure in that kind of art. And certainly his mindset concerning art, or his ideas concerning art, were in a way touched by the understanding of classical modern art of the time, and that is, a work of art is a product, if it is an important work of art like the Manet, it is a product of an individuum, one artist with a certain genius and a certain particular personal style. And that style is the most important factor in an artist, so to say, and that was certainly the case with Manet. And now Hugo von Tschudi, at the very same time, it's really interesting, you would hardly find, for example, today a director of, let's say, Tate Modern or a similar, or Reina Sofia, assemble the oeuvre of a 15th century painter. That was, in the 19th century, these scholars were universalist. It was easier then, but nevertheless, it's most remarkable. And I think this view, this point of view of Tschudi from modern art is very important for what he did. So he assembled about 12 works. And here, this counts as one work, as these three panels belong together. They're at the Städelmuseum in Frankfurt am Main, and they are at the Städelmuseum since mid-19th century, and they were at the time thought to be by Rogier van der Weyden. And Hugo von Tschudi, when he brought together the oeuvre of the 15th century master that has until then not been recognized, at least not as an artistic personality, he chose these panels as the eponymous work that is the work which gave the name to the master, because in Tschudi's judgment, and he was certainly not wrong with that, these panels are the most important work among the whole group. And these panels purportedly came from an abbey called Flémalle, and Flémalle is a place in the vicinity of Liège, in present-day Belgium on the Meuse River. And it was said that they come from an abbey in Flémalle, a big abbey. Only a couple of years later, it turned out there was never, ever an abbey at Flémalle. And so this was, of course, a fake provenance given by a former owner who wanted to avoid any valuable information on the provenance of these paintings. So, and it's very adequate for this figure, this artistic figure which was created by von Tschudi, that it was named after panels coming from a place that in fact never existed. However, the panels of course exist, and you can see it's the Virgin Mary and St. Veronica with the veil, and then here it's a Holy Trinity given as a stone sculpture. And after these panels, said to be from Flémalle, Hugo von Tschudi named his new artist, der Meister von Flémalle, the master of Flémalle, el Maestro de Flémalle, or le Maître de Flémalle. And he assembled other works, and I will show you just a couple of them. Not all, as I said, 12 in total, but it would be confusing to show them all, but very famous is this one, of course, a so-called Merode altarpiece, a triptych with the Annunciation at the center, today in New York, at the Cloisters collection. And this painting, the Nativity, today in Dijon, in the museum, a very nice and famous painting. And if you ask yourself, what can be seen, for example, what are these two women doing there? They are the midwives who have come to help Mary giving birth, which proved then in the end not to be necessary. And what is shown here, and it's rarely shown, therefore I explain it, one of the two midwives doubted that Mary as a virgin gave birth to the child and remained a virgin. And she says, and this is written on the banderole, I will not believe it if I haven't touched her to prove. And in this very moment, because she was not believing, her hand withered, and therefore it's hanging down, powerless. However, an angel here tells her, touch the child, and you will be all right again. So a first miracle that happened. And the other midwife, by the way, this one here, as is written on the banderole, she believed right from the start that the Virgin Mary has given birth to God's Son. So you all know this painting because it's here at the Prado Museum, the betrothal of the Virgin, and in the back, the miracle of the rod which was blooming that Joseph got. And this one also in the Prado Museum, and presently, according to, I think, the official assumption here at the Prado and with many other scholars, a painting that has nothing to do with this one. I'm not really of that opinion. I think the two belong together, but that isn't the point of discussion here. For von Tschudi, these two formed a unit and were remnants of one and the same altarpiece. And another work you all know here from the Prado galleries, the so-called Werl altarpiece, which is dated here at the bottom line to 1438, and even the name of the donor kneeling here, a Franciscan monk, is given. It is Henricus de Werlis, Heinrich of Werl, and he was a Franciscan friar and prior in Cologne, Germany. And the whole work, and of course the central panel is missing today, and it's already missing for a long time. And the former triptych was obviously installed in the Franciscan church in Cologne. And nobody knows how it came here first to the royal collections of Spain and then to the Prado. And another work that Tschudi brought into the discussion or identified as a work by his Master of Flémalle, this pair of portraits, probably a couple, a man and a woman, at the National Gallery in London. And this work, a crucifixion, where, by the by, the background with the landscape from here on is completely overpainted. There was first a gilded background, which was already realized by von Tschudi, and this is the overpainting is from the 16th century. And he put this in the same group, and also this work that some of you might know, it's in the National Gallery London, and it's just a fragment showing the Magdalene reading in a book, and it was part of a large Sacra Conversazione, and you can still see here a portion of St. John the Evangelist and of St. Joseph. And this is interesting and brings us immediately into the discussion about these works. For Hugo von Tschudi, this was a work by his Master of Flémalle because it is so similar to the reading St. Barbara of the Werl altarpiece wings here in the Prado, and it's very obvious that there is a close relationship between the two. And so Tschudi concluded, okay, they are so close, they must be from one shop, but he also realized that stylistically they do not completely agree. But of course for his 19th century mind, if a figure was so close to another one, two paintings with showing almost an identical figure, it was, I think, for him, the most convincing explanation was that these two figures were made in one and the same shop, because it would have been the standard of one artist or one workshop to use these figures. In fact, as we know today, figures like that, they wandered from one shop to the other, and much later workshops could even, of course, repeat a figure by a different master, and that was usual thing in the 15th century, but it was not what painters in the 19th century would have done, and therefore, for von Tschudi, this, well, must have happened in one and the same workshop. Interesting thing is that today, in London at least, this Magdalene is seen as one of the absolute highlights in the oeuvre of Rogier van der Weyden. At least this is the opinion of Lon Campbell, who wrote a very important catalogue on the London collection of early Netherlandish paintings. And for him, this is Rogier at his best. I'm not so sure if this is the case, however, it is certainly a work from the Rogier van der Weyden group. But what you can see here in this example is the basic problem of the whole Flémalle van der Weyden discussion. As I said, Hugo von Tschudi created this artist, the master of Flémalle, by assembling 12 works, which were until then, at least most of them were separated or not attributed to a certain painter, just called Netherlandish or so. A few of them were brought together into groups, but nothing was so very convincing of it, and so he created this oeuvre. And this oeuvre, and maybe you have realized it yourself if you look at it, for example, these two works, and these two, and these two, they are in a way a bit heterogeneous. I think this is really not an oeuvre as we know it from so many other painters, even painters who vary in the course of their production time, but who are basically and essentially the same. Here there is quite a lot of difference and, and a very particular kind of difference, because some of these works resemble very strongly works by Rogier van der Weyden that were already accepted in the late 19th century as works by Rogier van der Weyden, especially the large Descent from the Cross, here in the Prado, the most important work by Rogier van der Weyden, but there are others. Some of these works resemble Rogier van der Weyden, and others bear a certain resemblance to works by Jan van Eyck. But for Tschudi, the whole thing was not really a problem, because in Tschudis eyes, this master he had created, the master of Flémalle, was a follower of Rogier van der Weyden. So what he noted was a certain kind of eclecticism in the works he had assembled. That's a painter, a very good painter in his eye, a very good artist, but not really a true creative genius, but a secondary master with great skills and a very good craftsman, however, deeply relying on the works of somebody else, and that is in the first place the great genius Rogier van der Weyden. Well, and as you all know, Rogier van der Weyden is and was all the time a very famous and important artist. The very early sources that we have the earliest sources telling us something about early Netherlandish painting. That is, in the first place, Italian writers of the 15th century, like Giovanni Santi, the father of the great Raphael. These writers mention Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden as the two major figures of Netherlandish art of the time. Or take Dürer, on whom you will hear a lecture at the end of this cycle, as far as I know. Dürer traveled to the Netherlands in 1520, and what he saw were works by Johannes, that is Jan van Eyck, and by Rogier van der Weyden. And he admired them both. And he also saw works by Hugo van der Goes. So these were very well-known painters, and the fame of both Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden continued from the 15th century through all times, let's say, until the 19th century. Even if there was not much knowledge anymore about Rogier van der Weyden, he was still very well known as one of the founding fathers of early Netherlandish painting. And one of the major reasons, of course, for the wide knowledge on Rogier was that he occurs twice, even by an error twice, in Karel van Maander's Schilderboek, that is the book on painting by Karel van Maander, that Dutch writer, and that was published in 1604. It was the very first historiography of Netherlandish art, so formed after the model of Vasari, who had already published in 1550 his Vitae, the lives of Italian artists. And half a century later, Karel van Maander followed, and Karel van Maander says, let's say, the beginning of all Netherlandish art and painting is Jan van Eyck, and one of his most important, his immediate follower, is Rogier van der Weyden. And then come some others, like Dirk Bouts, Hugo van der Goes, Albert van Auwaerter, you name it. So these artists were all very well known, and Rogier almost very famous. However, the Master of Flémalle, of course, was unknown, as this was an artificial name, only created on the spot. But there was, in all historical writings and historiographical writings, not one name that seemed to fit to this artist, and certainly not a famous name. And so the situation, or the image that von Tschudi formed, and that was first followed by other scholars, was there is a great Rogier van der Weyden, and he had a follower and imitator, the so-called Master of Flémalle, who worked partially in the style of Rogier, but who also drew inspirations from Jan van Eyck and maybe others. So that was around 1900, that was the status quo. A new painter was introduced, and this was a painter who was seen as a kind of eclecticist, following in the wake of Rogier van der Weyden. And by the by, if we look here, oops, this is here, it's a well altarpiece. Here, this is a detail of the right-hand side wing. The well altarpiece, as I said, bears a date. You all know that from the gallery. It's 1438. And von Tschudi, and after him others, wondered about the early date, 1438. You know, that is really early for 15th century painting. You must think of the earliest dated work in all Flemish painting that is preserved. That is a Ghent altarpiece by the brothers van Eyck, and that was finished according to its inscription in May 1432. And there are other paintings by Jan van Eyck dated to the 1430s, like the famous Arnolfini portrait in London dated to 34, or the Pale Madonna the Madonna of Canonicus van der Pale in Bruges, dated 1436, and so on. And this painting, dated 38, was very close to these productions by Jan van Eyck, and Jan van Eyck was still alive, by the by, in the year 1438, for he would only die in 38, yeah, because he would only die in 41. So for Tschudi and others, this was really astonishingly early for such a secondary artist. So this work by the Flémalle master was expanded in the following years, and I show you this because it's another nice connection between the collections in Madrid and Berlin. And here, the one on the left-hand side that surfaced in 1902 is in Berlin, and the other one that surfaced in 1957 and was recognized by, again, a Berlin scholar, by Friedrich Winkler, as a work from the Flémalle group that went into the Thyssen-Bornemisza collection and is now on the opposite side of the road in the Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza. So again, two works on which, of course, there were some discussions and quarrels which came first, and they are here shown at the same scale, so they are absolutely identical in size and shape. So one must be the model and the other one is a replica. So, and that was the case. Around 1900 we had this, now an oeuvre of about 14 or 15 works, and still called Master of Flémalle. And very close to that group, Master of Flémalle, were two panels, or rather 4 panels in the end, belonging to one and the same altarpiece. And again, what I can show you here is a panel on the left-hand side that is in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum here in Madrid, and the other one is at the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin. They are not very large, about that size wide, square-formed paintings. And the Berlin painting here, the Adoration of the Magi, had already had been compared to the works by the Flémalle master already by Hugo von Tschudi, because he knew that painting in Berlin. And he said, well, there is a minor painting by a much less gifted artist, a rather coarse painter, and that painter seems to be a pupil or a follower of the Flémalle master. Accordingly, he dated this painting to around 1460. Now, as you can see, I have written the name Jacques Darré underneath these two reproductions and given a quite different date, and that these panels are indeed by Jacques Darré and were already painted in 1434 to 1435 was found out by another very, very important scholar of early Netherlandish painting, Georges Hulin de Loo, a Belgian scholar who contributed tremendously to our knowledge of early Netherlandish painting, and he right from the start used a critical eye, and he looked at all the hypotheses and ideas put forward at the time critically, and to find out the real truth behind things. And this Hulin de Loo now succeeded in identifying these panels. 4 in total are preserved. Another one is in Berlin and one is in Paris in the Petit Palais. To identify them as the remnants of an altarpiece that was commissioned by the abbot of St. Vaast in Arras, that's in present-day northern France, in a Benedictine abbey, an altarpiece for the Marian Chapel, and that was commissioned with the painter Jacques Darré, and Darré painted on it in 1434 to 35, and in 1435 the work was ready and installed in a chapel in the Abbey of St. Vaast in Arras, and that was exactly the time when there was a famous peace conference of Arras, where peace between the English, the French, and the Burgundians was made. And all the visitors to the Abbey, they had to visit that altarpiece. I mean, we have a very interesting record of that the abbot was so proud of his paintings that he showed all his eminent guests around, and they had to admire these paintings. And so Hulin de Laux was the one who found that out. And as it happens, this work by Jacques Darré is the best documented of all early Netherlandish paintings, because we have a minute account on all the steps taken to accomplish the retable, the altarpiece to which they belonged. So there can be absolutely no doubt about its author and its date, and we know a lot about Jacques Darré, who became later a very sought-after painter. Now, what Hulin de Laux also realized, and that was something already seen, of course, by Hugo von Tschudi, was that one of the paintings, here, oh, this is strange, here they are of the same size. In fact, the one on the right-hand side is much smaller. No, it doesn't matter. What he found out is that this documented painting by Darré, this and another one, shows a very striking resemblance to one of the works from the Master of Flémalle groups, namely the Nativity in Dijon. And I mean, I think it is very clear to all of you, just if you look at it, you see the dilapidated stable, very similar here, and these groups of hovering angels above, and the two midwives again, and the way Mary's cloak is spread on the floor, and the naked child lying on the bare earth. That is very similar. And also I like to point out another tiny detail. If you look here at the background, I hope you can see that. There is a row of trees and they cast shadow. I hope that you can see it. It's very small here on my screen, and there are riders and people walking along here on the road. And if you go back here, in the Berlin painting, you have here the very same row of trees and some riders and people walking. And I hope you can see that these trees, they cast shadows. And all the other trees here in the painting do not cast shadows. Just this row of tree casts shadows. Oops. And because it was taken from this very painting, here are the trees with shadows, and therefore Darré's trees also cast shadow. And here you see again the Darré tree painted without the direct model, and again without any shadow. So it is perfectly clear that this painting by Darré is indeed dependent from this one, from the Flémalle group, and it is likewise absolutely clear that this is much inferior in terms of artistic quality. It really is a kind of, well, it's not a copy, but it's a kind of variant, but a little bit awkward in comparison. So, what Hulin de Laux now concluded was most important for the whole research, and that is, we know that Jacques Darré had worked for a long time, more than 15 years at least, in the workshop of a certain Robert Campin in Tournai. And Robert Campin was an important painter in Tournai, important at least from an economical point of view. And here you have some facts. This Robert Campin, who was born around 1375 and lived until 1444 or 45, And he lived and worked in Tournai as a master painter and is mentioned for the first time as master of the art of painting in 1406. And what we know, he had 4 collaborators at a time, and one is Jacques Darré, and Jacques Darré, is already documented in Campin's workshop in 1418, very early, so he must have been around 15 or so at the time. However, Jacques Darré is suddenly called, much later in 1427, called an apprentice of Robert Campin. And at the same time, another really famous person was in Campin's workshop, and that is Rogier van der Weyden. He too was about 25 years younger than Robert Campin, and he likewise became a so-called apprentice in Campin's shop in 1427, a bit earlier than Darré. And then there was another person of whom we know nothing else except that Reckitt Willemet, who became an apprentice in May 1427, and a certain 4th person, Aquin de Blondin. Again, we do not know anything about him except for that he became a so-called apprentice to Campin in March of 1426. So what Hulin Delot concluded was, all right, we have the oeuvre of the so-called Master of Flémalle. The oeuvre of the Master of Flémalle resembles the works of Rogier van der Weyden. We also have a documented work by Jacques Darré, which is deeply dependent on one of the works from the so-called Flémalle group. And thus his conclusion was almost unavoidable. The Master of Flémalle must be, according to Hulin Delot, of course, the teacher of both Darré and Rogier, the man, the master, with whom Jacques Darré stayed until 1432, and that is only 2 years before he painted the Arras altarpiece that is preserved. So, and Rogier van der Weyden, okay, we know quite a lot about him and his works, and as they resemble the Master of Flémalle works, the Master of Flémalle was identified with Robert Campin, and about Robert Campin we know a lot, but unfortunately not what we want to know, because, well, we know when he was born approximately and when he died, and that he was already in 1406, so at the age of about 30, a maître, a master, maestro, in Tournai. So that is very normal. At the age of 30, of course, he had his own workshop. And we know about 40 commissions that he received from the city of Tournai and from private persons between 1406 and 1441. So over a long time, long period of over 30 years. However, nearly all these commissions were for the polychromy of statues, for painting banners and flags, or for gilding inscriptions, etc. There is not a single document referring to the painting of a panel painting, the execution of a panel painting. Well, that does, of course, not mean that Campin never did this, in no way, but we must say all these documents that we have on Campin are absolutely mute and do tell us nothing about his artistic personality. He was very well off, he owned several houses, and he had this assistance, but obviously, but if he was really a great genius of art, we do simply not know. We know for certain that he was involved in the city's politics in the 1420s, when there was a kind of revolt going on. The patricians of the city were chased off, and all this obviously served Tournai bad, so it became a kind of a backwater for a long time, and it faced a severe economical decline after the events. Campin was also sometimes deacon of the Guild of Painters, and in July 1432 he was sentenced for adultery. This is, of course, it has something of the cliché that developed in the 19th century of an artist who took some liberties. And in the documents from Tournai, it is said that he is leading a dirty and dissolved life because he is living with a certain Laurence Paulette while he is married to another woman. So that was in a medieval society. That was a serious offense, of course, on morality, and Robert Campin was sentenced to 1 year of banishment from the city. However, 3 months later, the banishment was commuted into a fine, so he had to pay money. What is interesting, of course, in July 1432, he was sentenced, and if we look at his so-called apprentices, they all left, well, at least 3 of them left his workshop in 32, and both Rogier van der Weyden and Willemey became masters in August 1432, that is immediately after Campin had been sentenced for adultery, and Jacques Tarret became master in October 1432. That was still before the banishment was commuted into a fine. So obviously this has something to do with each other. The 3 of them became masters because Campin wouldn't have been able, when he was banished, to maintain his workshop any longer. And only a master, of course, was allowed to make contracts and to act as a businessman. So you can often read that Rogier van der Weyden was an apprentice of Campin, and I said in a document, both Tarret, Rogier van der Weyden, Willemette, and Aquin de Blondin were referred to as apprentices. So an apprentice is, of course, somebody who's learning his craft. Jacques Tarret had already been in the workshop 9 years before, in 1418, and I think Panofsky, it was Erwin Panofsky, who already pointed out rightly that nobody is doing an apprenticeship, is serving in an apprenticeship for 10 years or longer. So either you finish your apprenticeship successfully after 4 years, and that's the normal length for an apprenticeship, or you won't become a painter at all. But you do not do 12 years, or in this case it would be 14 years of apprenticeship. That is, of course, a nonsense. And Rogier van der Weyden, he was born in 1399. And in March 1427, when he was called an apprentice to Campin, he was already married and a father, and he was approximately 28 years old. Now, an apprenticeship would have started at the time at the age of about 12 to 14. And so, of course, Rogier van der Weyden's apprenticeship must have taken place, or must almost have been finished around 1415, so much earlier. And about Willemette and Aquin de Blondin, we do not know anything, but as the apprenticeship started at a very close date, we may assume that to all these 4 people, the same applied, that they were not apprentices in the strict sense of the word. That is, they were not learning their craft, but rather they were assistants, and the wrong term apprentice might come from the fact that all these documents referring to these people are not preserved in the original from 1432 or so, but only in a later transcription from around 1480 or later. And it might be that this is a fault of the, let's say, redaction, that something was written wrong. But one thing is clear, Rogier van der Weyden, and he is the most interesting person in this context, Rogier van der Weyden was definitely not an apprentice between 28 and 32 of his age, but he must have been a compagnon or assistant to Campin. Yeah, now this Robert Campin. It was widely accepted what Hulin de Lot suggested, that Robert Campin is the Flémalle master. However, there were some intrinsic problems in the construction of the Flémalle master's oeuvre that came to light a little bit later, and one who put his finger to the sore spot was the most important connoisseur of early Netherlandish painting, I think up to this day, and that was Max Jacob Friedländer, a curator and director of the Berlin museums, and he assembled, some of you might know that, a huge corpus called Early Netherlandish Painting, and trying to bring together all the oeuvres, all early Netherlandish paintings between around 1400 and the late 16th century. He stops with Peter Bröchel. So, and this Max Friedländer, who was always doubtful against the master of Flémalle, and who always doubted, even in former times, the identification of the Flémalle master with Robert Campin. He wrote an article, a very short article, which was nevertheless important, in 1931. And this article is entitled Flémalle Meister Dämmerung, Twilight of the Flémalle Master, and this is, of course, a parallel to a very famous musical drama and opera by Richard Wagner, Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods. And now here it's Twilight of the Flémalle Master. And he made this comparison, and I'm sure you know what I'm showing here, the stout man in Berlin, and here one of the figures of the large descent from the cross by Rogier van der Weyden here in the Prado Museum. And of course what Friedländer is suggesting with this comparison is these faces are so extremely similar, not only the individual that is depicted, but also the way that this stout man is portrayed, that it does not make sense to separate two oeuvres, or to draw a line between these two works and say, okay, the one on the right-hand side is by a master working in Tournai, and the other one is by a master working in Brussels and 25 years younger than the other. So, but the decisive argument for Friedländer is a different one. It's not so much, or not only the connoisseur's approach to these two paintings, but it's a more or less philosophical approach. He says, if the so-called master of Flémalle is an individual, is a real, separate, artistic personality, and like Campin, working virtually in the time before Rogier van der Weyden, then the great Rogier van der Weyden would become nothing than an imitator. So if all these achievements of the Flémalle master were really done by a different painter than Rogier himself, then Rogier would be a kind of imitator and very pale and non-distinct successor of a great genius. And of course, there is something right in his argumentation, because Rogier van der Weyden has always been hailed from mid-15th century onwards. I mean, one of the earliest instances is a letter by Nicolaus of Cusa, the great philosopher and theologian of the 15th century, who wrote around 1450 to some monks, and he spoke of the greatest of painters, Rogier. He compared something to a painting by Rogier, which he had seen, and he said the greatest of painters. So around 1450, during his lifetime, Rogier was already extremely famous, and he remained famous, whereas Robert Campin never achieved any fame. And so Friedlander's argument basically was, it is impossible that the great genius Rogier was in fact not a genius, but only an imitator. And that this rather unknown personality, Robert Campin, is instead the great genius. And so what Friedlander concluded at the time was that the whole of the Flémalle master's oeuvre was not done by Robert Campin, but is instead, or represents the early work that Rogier van der Weyden did between 1425 and 1440. So, more or less before he painted the large Descent from the Cross, which you can see here at the Prado. And of course, this idea is also highly problematic, and it must lead to a new, very strange development, and it did. And that started with the book by Moimir Frinta, published in 1966, and it was programmatically entitled The Genius of Robert Campin. So this is always, this PowerPoint is distorting the images a bit. So here the Veronica of the Flémalle panel, she should only be that high. Sorry, I do not know how to change that. Okay, actually her size is exactly the height, the side height of Rogier's panel. So she is much too large here. Sorry for that. So what happened then in 1966? What happened to Rogier and the Flémalle master and Robert Campin? Well, Frinta drew a very peculiar conclusion from former observations and in a way from what Friedlander has said. He indeed said, the great genius is not Rogier van der Weyden. Rogier is indeed secondary. The great genius is, in fact, Robert Campin. And consequently, the large Descent from the Cross here in the Prado is not by Rogier, it's by Robert Campin. Oh yes. And well, you can go each and every day to the Prado Museum, which is a fantastic privilege, I must say. And if you go there, you can, well, understand some of the observations that Frinta did. He said, for example, this figure, the Mary Magdalene, is rather flat, her face, and also the head of St. John the Evangelist. It's flat compared, for example, to the head of Joseph of Arimathea or the Virgin's head. And so what he suggested is, okay, the painting was commissioned with Robert Campin, and Robert Campin started to paint it, and of course he did the design, and he did not completely finish it. So here the figure of St. John and the Magdalene, they were not finished really, and the feet of Nicodemus, Frinta didn't like his feet because, well, it's a little bit strange because this is Nicodemus' right feet and this is the left feet, so he's twisting his legs. And this is something that Frinta didn't like because a genius like Robert Campin would not twist the legs of a figure. So this was Rogier, of course. And the Magdalene, the flat Magdalene, was also Rogier. But basically, this work, according to Frinta, was Rogier was Robert Campin. A very strange development. At that time, of course, it was no longer possible to do what Friedländer had done and what is, in a way, more historically logical, that is, to attribute the Flémalle oeuvre to Rogier instead of attributing major works by Rogier to the Flémalle master. That was no longer possible because some other works had turned up and had been attributed to the Flémalle master, or rather Robert Campin. For example, this triptych in the Quartet Institute in London, the so-called Zeiland triptych, attributed to Campin in 1944 in Plain War when it surfaced. And of course, this is a kind of master of Flémalle style that is can hardly be reconciled with Rogier van der Weyden, because it looks much more archaic. And I must say, if we compare it, for example, to the Dijon Nativity, it still looks much more archaic. And so it's, even though the garments are spread on the floor in a very similar way, the tonality, it's hard to see in this projection, of course. This is much more grayish and opaque, and all the translucent enamel-like quality of this painting is absolutely absent here. And all the shadows are blackish, whereas here they are translucent. So there are many, many differences. And of course, here in this painting, you have the feeling that the light has been switched on and that the light is shining on the objects, for example, on the hairs of the Virgin, whereas here there is nothing like that. This is all very indistinct in terms of its materiality. And if we look at the landscape, well, I think it's no need to explain that there is a big, big difference. So this work, as a work by the master of Flémalle, was also compared, of course, to the Miro triptych. Again, it's not really the same. And I think if one would show them side by side once, which will hardly happen, they would turn out to be rather different. However, the Miro triptych, the Annunciation and its Censure, has a kind of twin. And this you can see here. So this is a painting in Brussels in the museum with a gold ground instead of a blue sky. And this is the central panel of the Miro triptych. And as you can see, they are extremely close, but not in each and every detail. And of course, the pose of the Virgin and the moment of the Annunciation has been changed. So here, the Virgin, in the Miro triptych, the Virgin is obviously surprised or has not even remarked that the angel is here. And in the other painting, she is accepting her roles. So this is the moment when she is saying, Ecce ancilla Domini, and this is the moment when she is already pregnant. And here is a little woodcut showing St. Christopher bearing the Christ child, and this is a symbol, of course, of pregnancy of Mary. So slightly different moment, otherwise much the same composition, and here each and every fold is identical, but definitely not one and the same artist. They are extremely different in terms of execution. However, the panel in Brussels comes close, in my eyes, very close to this so-called Zeiland triptych. And if we compare the faces, this is the Annunciation in Brussels, and this is the Annunciation of the Miro triptych. You can easily see that they do not have much in common. I mean, look at this thin, shiny, golden hair, and then you have here these big tresses that could have been carved out of wood, for example. But if you compare it, I'm sorry, this is not a very good image. Good images are not available of this work. But I hope that you can see it, that the way these faces are modeled and this special hairstyle, this rather compact hair, is rather similar in these two works. And in my eyes, it could even be by the same artist, who knows. And again, if we look at the Virgin Mary from the Nativity in Dijon, which I've shown before, again, we remark a certain similarity, a limited similarity of facial types, but a completely different execution. So it's not so easy to reconcile this work with the others. And in the case, so I will jump this a little bit, because here I cannot come to any conclusion. I must say they are similar, but I do not know. So this is one group of works here, all these works that have been assembled under the name of Flémalle Campin. Likewise, however, they differ from other works in the Campin group or Flémalle group. And in the case of these two Annunciations, one thing is most remarkable, and that has been found out by a group of Dutch scholars in 1992 only. That is namely this painting, much less famous than the Miraut altarpiece and looking much more archaic and less refined, is definitely the model for this one. This became clear from the underdrawing. Some of the changes that you see here were only introduced in the course of execution, and when this was underdrawn, it resembled in some aspects stronger to this painting. So indeed, this it comes first, and this is the variant, not really copy. So it's not so easy what to make of it. Huh? So the work of the great genius here is following another work which was always called by a pupil of the great genius, the work of a pupil of the great genius. So this is, again, very complicated, but we will leave that for a moment and turn to the other half of the Flémalle oeuvre, and that is the part or the portion of the Flémalle oeuvre that was the reason for Friedländer to attribute it to Rogier van der Weyden, and among them is this crucifixion in Berlin. And this crucifixion is indeed extremely Rogerian in style, especially if we compare it to this drawing, and I only show you the middle section. What we can see here, of course, is that there are extremely similar figures, and they have been varied in a very particular way. That is, all the people that turn inward here turn outward here, and the people that are turned towards us are turned away from us in the drawing. And you can see it here. So St. John is turned away from us in the painting and turned towards us in the drawing. And here, this Mary sitting on the floor is turning towards us here and turning away. And again here, this Oriental woman with the turban is turned towards us, and here she is turned away. And accordingly, it also makes sense that the loincloth is floating to the left-hand side in the painting and to the right-hand side in the drawing, and the Virgin Mary in this very exaggerated pose, which is extremely rare in painting of the time, is embracing the cross here, and is in the act of embracing, obviously, is throwing her arms upward in the other painting, in the drawing, sorry. So these are variations on more or less the same figures, and I think that that kind of variation is only conceivable within one and the same workshop. Hardly in two different workshops, one in Brussels and one in Tournai, because this drawing was certainly done in Rogier's shop in Brussels, and there is, for example, now you can, here, you can see it here, there is a little R, the letter R, like Rogier. It is on this drawing, and this is one of a number of drawings showing that letter, and obviously all these drawings indeed come from the shop of Rogier, and it doesn't mean that he himself had drawn it, but they are obviously a kind of trademark. And then this drawing is clearly the work of the draftsman who did this drawing of the so-called Skupstuhl, and this drawing is one that can be linked to Rochier's shop by documents. So, and a very similar case we have here with the Well panels here in Madrid. I mentioned that Hugo von Tschudi, of course, compared them to the Merode altarpiece. Okay, here is a kneeling donor in front of a door, and here is somebody seated on a bench. There are similarities. On the other hand, there are also many differences. For example, here in the perspective, this is a very short perspective, very short space here. It is much deeper. Of course, the similarities are there, but at the same time, there are many similarities to this Annunciation, which is always attributed to Rogier van der Weyden or Rochier's workshop, at least. And it's an Annunciation that was painted around the same time as this wing at the end of the 1430s. And we can go on with that. It has already early on been remarked that this left-hand side wing of the Well altarpiece shows a quotation from Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, and this is dated 1434, so in the Well altarpiece it occurs only 4 years later. And the same inspiration by the work of van Eyck you can see in the Annunciation by Rogier van der Weyden. You see, for example, the mirror goes there, the bench with the cushions goes there, the open window with the landscape goes there, whereas the chandelier goes there, and the red bed goes there, and then here is a chair. It's not easy to see. A chair is standing there, and it goes there. So, and this has been recognized independently of the Well altarpiece long ago, that this, of course, comes from Jan van Eyck. So there are these two works, the Well panel attributed to the Flémalle master and the panel definitely from Rochier's shop, inspired by the very same work at the very same time. And there is another most important and very famous similarity, and that is the pitcher and basin here, made of brass, and there. And Panofsky has already compared these two and found, well, they are different in approach, and they clearly show that two different painters have been involved here. And for Panofsky, that was a kind of proof that this is Rogier and this is Campin, two different artists. And he might well be right with the assumption that these are two different painters. However, he missed the most important point in it, because if you compare the two objects, you can very clearly see that this is one and the same object. It's not just two basins of which there are dozens or hundreds. They never occur in that shape and form in any other painting. So, and this is, you can even compare the minute detail, this is the same object, but it is seen from two different angles. Very clearly, here you see the snouts from the front, the openings, here the holes, and here it's seen much from the side, so as if two different artists had drawn these objects sitting at different angles towards the thing, the basin. And again, this is, in my eyes, a very clear indication that these two objects, this object, the two drawings, the two representations of the same object must have been made in one and the same workshop. It's hardly feasible that one painter had such an object in Tournai and painted it there, and at the same time another painter in Brussels painted the very same thing. And according to general belief, as I said, these are painters of two different generations, the one about 25 years the senior of the other. And the same applies to the left-hand side wing of the Well altarpiece. And I'd like to draw your attention towards the landscape. You can see a landscape here, and here there are two images, two paintings generally attributed to Rogier, The Visitation in Leipzig and St. Catherine in Vienna, both works probably from the 1440s. And now if we compare the landscape and the way, for example, trees, etc. were painted, this is the Well altarpiece, this is the Visitation in Leipzig, and this is Vienna, St. Catherine, and look at these snowy mountains and everything, and a little horseman on a white horse here and there. So this is almost the same, I would say. Now, come back to the Master of Flémalle and Rogier van der Weyden and the suggestion by Frenta, namely that this painter, the great genius, was also responsible for Rogier van der Weyden's large descent from the cross. And I must say, in this case, I'm rather adamant. And I think if you look at historical sources, there can be absolutely no doubt that this work is by Rogier van der Weyden. And Rogier van der Weyden became famous exactly for this work. It has been hailed as one of the greatest achievements by Rogier van der Weyden very early on. And so I think it's a complete nonsense to say, oh, this is by this otherwise completely unknown Robert Campin, despite the fact that this theory has been revived 20 years ago by a certain Felix Türlemann in a huge monograph on Campin. There you can find this painting again as a Robert Campin. However, what's about Frenta's observation that some of these faces are extremely close to each other? So this is the Veronica from the Flémalle panels. This is the Morning Mary here in the large descent from the cross. And of course, different, this is slightly blurred, there is no better image of it, but if you look at the way wrinkles were painted and the certain liveliness of the mouth, you know, the impression of indeed a soft, already a little bit too soft flesh with these little wrinkles, etc., and the bloodless lips, etc. This is indeed very, very close, one must say. It's very hard to draw a line here, whereas if you compare her, for example, to this lady, this is the same facial type, no doubt. However, it's not so good to see in the reproduction, but well, if you go upstairs, you will find that she's much smaller, one must admit, but nevertheless, this is the same type of face, but it's a completely different painterly approach. And if you continue, here again is Veronica, and this is the head of Nicodemus from the large descent from the cross. And again, one finds, look here, how the eyelids were painted with this dark line there, and then some moisture here at the lower lid, and here the way these rather graphic wrinkles in the corner of the eye are drawn. And even better, we take this beautiful portrait of a young woman in London, always described as a big achievement, an absolute masterwork of Robert Campin. But if we put it into a line with the Veronica from Frankfurt and the Nicodemus from Rogier's large descent from the cross, and her, I must say, at least I'm convinced of that, I must say that it would make any sense to separate these two as works of two different artists from different generations and working in different places. So, I mean, everything here, again, look at the eyes, this is virtually almost identical, despite the fact that they are completely different faces, of course. And the power and plasticity of the faces, again, in my eyes, is extremely close to each other. And if we compare another work, which you have not seen before, this is a portrait of a young lady, always and almost unanimously attributed to Rogier van der Weyden, and I think rightly so. It's in Berlin, and the lady from London. And what you cannot see here is the faces are of exactly the same size. And what we did once is to take tracing, so we put a translucent foil both on this face, or this portrait, and on this portrait, and we made drawings from the original on a foil, and then we placed these two foils on top of each other, and the red lines are the outlines of the London lady, and the black lines are the outlines of the Berlin lady. And what you can see here is the eyes deviate, the forehead is different, but then look here, the mouth, the chin, and the line, the contour line, and even the folds here, they are absolutely identical. And what I mean with identical is identical. So they are not similar because they match 100%. And as I said, these are the tracings taken from the original. So there is absolutely no adjustment of size or so. It's the absolute size. It's absolutely the same. And again, I think this can only be explained by the fact that these two portraits were made in one and the same shop with the help of the same drawing, or rather with the help of the same stencil or so. So that this was clearly a mechanical aid that was that was used to give these two likenesses. And of course, it says something about the naturalistic approach, which is, of course, has to be relevated in a way. Both are not handmade photographs, but both use a certain type and a stencil, so to say. So you might now think that I'm a little bit overcritical and that, according to my view, the genius of Robert Campin doesn't exist, and maybe there is not a single work preserved by Robert Campin. Maybe there are works preserved by Robert Campin, but in my eyes at least, not the whole group that has been assembled under the conventional name of Master of Flémalle can be by one painter, and certainly not by old Robert Campin. And you might find this something like a dissident's voice, which is really dissident from nearly all common knowledge. But this is in fact not the case, and I made this little graphic, and I hope you can understand what it means. Sorry, I only had the black and white reproduction I once made. And what I have here are the oeuvres suggested by 4 eminent scholars on early Netherlandish painting, and all these suggestions took place between 1995 and 2002, and they all come from big and important monographs on the artists. And there was Albert Châtelet with the book on Robert Campin, Le Maestro de Flémalle, and it's a light oval, and you see it comprises all these works. And then comes Dirk de Vos in 1999 with the book on Roger van der Weyden. And Dirk de Vos comprised these works as by Campin, but these 3 not. And then comes Lorne Campbell, a catalogue of the National Gallery London. Lorne Campbell is certainly the most important of all these scholars, and Lorne Campbell published his book in 1998, and I will be finished in a minute. No, don't panic, it will be over soon. So Lorne Campbell saw, here this is the circle of Lorne Campbell, and he saw all these works as by Robert Campin's own hand, but not the Miro triptych and not the Salting Madonna, which I have not yet mentioned. And then came in 2002 Felix Türlemann with a big monograph that was published both in German and English, a big book with many, many colored illustrations. And he was very generous. He included Rogier van der Weyden's large descent from the cross, but left out originally, he's very original in leaving out the man, the pendant to the woman. So for him, the man is by Rogier and the woman is by Campin, and this is also Campin. So you see, all these four scholars are convinced of Robert Campin as a great master and big genius and founding father of early Netherlandish painting, but there are only 3 works in total that all of them would give to the Robert Campin, and in other instances they deviate. And if I would add Martin Davis and Moimir Frinter to this, we would in the end have just 1 work in the censure as Robert Campin, namely the Virgin from Flémalle. So, to conclude, what I think is that, again, a little bit big, okay, I think that a number of works which are usually united under the name Robert Campin today must be given indeed to the Rogier van der Weyden group, and in the first place, works like this. She has much in common. She's almost identical in style, I would say, with the large descent from the cross, but she has much less in common, very little in common, actually, with a work like this, and this is, of course, a detail of your Prado's betrothal of the Virgin. This is one group, and then there is, here's the betrothal complete. There is another group, including the more archaic-looking works, and maybe Robert Campin was responsible here, I do not know. They look more archaic, however, we do not know if they really were made earlier or much earlier. This is unknown. None of the works except the Real altarpiece is dated. So this would be one group which is still, there is still research necessary. And then, in my eyes, there is the other group which comprises these works, and all of them are, in my eyes, extremely close to Rogier van der Weyden and must have been made in his shop, where he had already in the 1430s a substantial number of assistants. Thank you very much.